In the grand corridors of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal protocol have shaped every conversation and gesture, a single moment of defiance would echo through the halls of British royalty forever. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March 2024 when 8-year-old Princess Charlotte of Wales proved that royal blood runs deeper than diplomatic courtesy. What began as a routine state visit from European dignitaries quickly transformed into a masterclass in royal authority that left seasoned courtiers speechless, and foreign guests reconsidering their assumptions about the young princess they had dismissed as merely another child in the royal family. The royal guard who witnessed this extraordinary exchange would later describe it as the moment he truly understood what it meant to serve the crown. For in those few decisive minutes, Princess Charlotte didn't just defend her position. She defined it, drawing a line between guest and sovereign that would reshape how the world viewed the future of the British monarchy. This is the true story of how a young princess reminded everyone in the room exactly who belonged to the bloodline that has ruled Britain for over 1,000 years, and who was simply visiting. The morning of March 15th, 2024, started like any other day at Windsor Castle. The ancient stone walls, which had sheltered British royalty for nearly 1,000 years, were preparing to host a delegation from the European Union. The visit was meant to strengthen diplomatic ties and discuss trade agreements following recent political changes across the continent. Princess Charlotte had been looking forward to this particular day for weeks. Her governess had explained that she would have the opportunity to practice her French and German with real European officials, something that excited the linguistically gifted 8-year-old. Charlotte had always been fascinated by languages, often surprising her tutors with her quick grasp of pronunciation and grammar that seemed to come naturally to her. The castle staff had been preparing for days. Every piece of silver was polished to perfection, every tapestry straightened, and every surface cleaned until it gleamed. The state dining room had been set with the finest china, and the grand reception hall was arranged with fresh flowers from the castle gardens. Security protocols had been reviewed multiple times, and the royal guard was positioned throughout the castle according to precise instructions that had been refined over decades of similar visits. Charlotte's morning began with her usual routine. She woke at 7 o'clock sharp, a habit instilled by her parents who believed in maintaining structure even within the privileged walls of royalty. After washing and dressing in a carefully selected navy blue dress with subtle embroidered details that reflected both her royal status and her age-appropriate style, she joined her brothers Prince George and Prince Louis for breakfast in the family dining room. The family dining room, unlike the grand halls used for state functions, was a more intimate space where the Wales family could maintain some semblance of normal family life. The walls were decorated with personal photographs and artwork created by the children themselves, creating a warm atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the formal portraits and historical paintings found throughout the rest of the castle. During breakfast, Prince William briefed his children on the day's events. Charlotte listened intently as her father explained the importance of the visit and reminded them of proper protocol when meeting foreign dignitaries. She asked thoughtful questions about the visitors, showing an interest in politics and diplomacy that often surprised adults who expected typical childish concerns. Charlotte's governess, Miss Sarah Patterson, had arrived early that morning to review the princess's lessons and ensure she was properly prepared for her role in the day's events. Miss Patterson, a Cambridge graduate with extensive experience in royal education, had been working with Charlotte for 2 years and had developed a deep respect for the young princess's intelligence and natural grace under pressure. The European delegation was led by Ambassador Henrik Larsson from Denmark, a distinguished diplomat in his 60s who had spent decades navigating the complex world of international relations. Accompanying him were several other officials, including French cultural attaché Marie Dubois, German trade representative Klaus Müller, and Italian economic advisor Sofia Romano. Each had their own agenda for the visit, and all had been thoroughly briefed on royal protocol. What the delegation hadn't been prepared for was the level of involvement the royal children would have in the proceedings. They had expected brief, formal introductions followed by adult conversations while the children were escorted away by their caregivers. This assumption would prove to be their first miscalculation of the day. As the morning progressed, Charlotte completed her regular studies with Miss Patterson. They reviewed European history, focusing particularly on the relationships between Britain and the visiting nations. Charlotte demonstrated her knowledge by discussing the historical ties between the royal families of Europe, showing an understanding that impressed even her experienced governess. At 11 o'clock, the family gathered in the grand reception hall to await their guests. Charlotte stood beside her parents, her posture perfect and her expression composed. She wore a small but significant piece of jewelry that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II, a delicate gold bracelet that connected her to generations of royal women who had stood in similar positions throughout British history. The grand reception hall itself was a testament to British royal history. Its soaring ceilings were decorated with intricate moldings that had been crafted by master artisans centuries ago. Portraits of monarchs dating back to William the Conqueror lined the walls, creating an atmosphere of continuity and permanence that reminded all visitors of the enduring nature of the British crown. When the European delegation arrived, they were received with the full ceremony that such occasions demanded. The Welsh guards provided an honor guard, their red tunics and tall bearskin hats creating a spectacular display of British military tradition. The sound of their synchronized footsteps echoed through the castle courtyards as they escorted the visitors to the main entrance. Ambassador Larson led the group as they were formally introduced to the royal family. Each delegation member bowed or curtsied appropriately as they met Prince William and Princess Catherine. When they were introduced to the children, Charlotte stepped forward with confidence that belied her young age. Her curtsy was perfect, performed with a grace that had been refined through months of careful instruction. She greeted each visitor in their native language, switching effortlessly from French to German to Italian as she welcomed them to Windsor Castle. The delegation members exchanged glances of surprise and approval at her linguistic abilities. What struck the visitors most was not just Charlotte's technical skills, but her natural confidence and the way she carried herself. There was something in her bearing that suggested she understood exactly who she was and what her presence represented. It was as if she had been born knowing that she belonged in these grand halls, surrounded by centuries of royal history. The morning's formal proceedings went smoothly. The adults discussed various diplomatic matters while the children were given a special tour of the castle's art collection. Charlotte served as an unofficial guide, sharing stories about various paintings and artifacts that she had learned during her private lessons with the castle's curators. Her knowledge impressed the delegation members, but it was her obvious comfort in the royal environment that truly caught their attention. While other children might have been overwhelmed by the formality and grandeur, Charlotte moved through the halls of Windsor as if they were simply an extension of her natural habitat. As lunchtime approached, the group made their way to the state dining room. The table had been set with exquisite attention to detail, using china and crystal that had been collected by the royal family over generations. Each place setting represented thousands of pounds worth of precious materials, and The entire room sparkled with the light from crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across the walls. Charlotte was seated between Ambassador Larson and Marie Du Bois, a position that allowed her to continue practicing her language skills while engaging in conversations that were both educational and diplomatic. She asked thoughtful questions about their countries and listened attentively to their responses, demonstrating the kind of genuine interest that seasoned diplomats rarely encountered. During the meal, Charlotte noticed that Klaus Müller, the German trade representative, seemed particularly interested in the castle's architecture and history. She took it upon herself to share some of the stories she had learned about the construction of various parts of the building, explaining how different monarchs had added their own touches over the centuries. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and soon the entire table was engaged in a lively discussion about European royal history and the connections between various noble families across the continent. Charlotte's contributions to the conversation demonstrated not just memorized facts, but a genuine understanding of how historical events had shaped the modern relationships between nations. As the meal progressed, Charlotte began to sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere. While the adults maintained their polite, diplomatic facade, she detected undercurrents of tension that seemed to be building towards something. Her natural intuition, honed by years of observing adult interactions in formal settings, told her that this visit might become more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The first sign of trouble came when Ambassador Larson made a casual comment about how refreshing it was to see royal children who were just like ordinary kids despite their privileged circumstances. While meant as a compliment, Charlotte sensed something condescending in his tone that suggested he viewed her family's position as somehow less substantial than it appeared. Marie Du Bois followed with her own observation about how modern royalty had evolved beyond the outdated traditions of previous generations. Again, while diplomatically phrased, Charlotte detected an underlying suggestion that the traditional aspects of monarchy were becoming increasingly irrelevant in contemporary Europe. These seemingly innocent comments created an atmosphere that Charlotte found increasingly uncomfortable. She began to realize that her family's guests might not hold the same respect for the institution of monarchy that she had been raised to understand and protect. This growing awareness would soon lead to a confrontation that none of the adults in the room saw coming. The stage was being set for a clash between different worldviews about the role of royalty in modern society. On one side stood centuries of tradition, embodied by an 8-year-old princess who had been born into a legacy stretching back over a millennium. On the other side stood modern European diplomatic thinking that viewed traditional monarchy as an interesting historical curiosity rather than a living, breathing institution worthy of genuine respect. As the luncheon continued, Charlotte's protective instincts began to awaken. She might have been only 8 years old, but she carried within her the genetic memory of generations of monarchs who had defended their realm against all challenges. The confrontation that was building would test whether that royal inheritance was strong enough to assert itself through someone so young, or whether diplomatic courtesy would require her to accept perspectives that diminished everything she had been raised to value and protect. The afternoon session was scheduled to take place in the Blue Drawing Room, an intimate space within Windsor Castle that had hosted countless diplomatic meetings throughout British history. The room's azure silk wallpaper and gold-framed mirrors created an elegant atmosphere that encouraged both formal discourse and more personal conversations between visiting dignitaries and members of the royal family. Charlotte had been invited to join this portion of the visit as part of her ongoing education in diplomatic protocol. Her parents believed that exposure to international relations from an early age would better prepare her for her future role within the royal family. What they hadn't anticipated was how this particular group of visitors would test their daughter's understanding of her position in ways that no textbook or formal lesson could have prepared her for. As the group settled into the comfortable chairs and settees arranged throughout the room, Charlotte positioned herself near a large window that overlooked the castle gardens. From this vantage point, she could observe both the magnificent grounds that had been her playground since childhood and the facial expressions of the adults as their conversation began to take on a more serious tone. Ambassador Larson initiated the discussion by expressing his delegation's interest in understanding how the British royal family viewed its role in contemporary European politics. His question seemed innocuous enough, but Charlotte detected something in his manner that suggested he was probing for information that went beyond simple diplomatic curiosity. Prince William responded with characteristic diplomacy, explaining how the monarchy served as a stabilizing influence that transcended political parties and provided continuity during periods of governmental transition. His words were carefully chosen to acknowledge both the traditional role of the crown and its adaptation to modern democratic principles. Klaus Müller, the German trade representative, then offered his perspective on how various European nations had evolved their governmental structures to meet contemporary needs. While he spoke respectfully, Charlotte noticed that his comments seemed designed to highlight how progressive nations had moved away from traditional monarchical systems in favor of what he termed more democratic approaches. The conversation continued in this vein for several minutes, with the European visitors gradually introducing ideas that subtly questioned the relevance of hereditary monarchy in the modern world. They spoke of equal representation, merit-based leadership, and democratic accountability in ways that seemed to suggest these concepts were somehow incompatible with constitutional monarchy. Charlotte listened intently to every word, her young mind processing not just the explicit content of the discussion, but also the underlying implications of what was being said. She began to understand that her family's guests were not simply engaging in academic discourse about governmental systems. They were, in their diplomatically polite way, challenging the very foundation upon which her existence was built. Marie Du Bois contributed to the discussion by describing how France had successfully modernized its approach to governance by eliminating what she called antiquated hierarchical structures. While she was careful not to directly criticize the British system, her implication was clear. Truly progressive nations had moved beyond the need for hereditary leadership. Charlotte's governess, Miss Patterson, sat quietly in the corner, taking notes and occasionally glancing toward the princess with growing concern. She could see the tension building in Charlotte's posture as the conversation continued to develop along lines that were increasingly critical of everything the young princess had been taught to value and protect. The turning point came when Sofia Romano, the Italian economic advisor, made what she probably considered a light-hearted observation about how charming it was to see children growing up in such fairy tale surroundings. Her tone suggested that she viewed the entire institution of monarchy as a kind of elaborate theatrical performance rather than a legitimate governmental structure. Charlotte felt her face flush with anger, but she maintained her composure as she had been taught. Royal training had instilled in her the ability to control her emotional responses even under pressure, but she could feel her patience wearing thin as the adults continued their veiled assault on everything her family represented. Ambassador Larson then made a comment that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. He suggested that while the British royal family served an important symbolic function, the real work of governing was done by elected officials who could be held accountable by the people they served. His words carried an unmistakable implication that hereditary monarchy was, at best, an expensive decoration with little practical value. Charlotte's eyes narrowed as she processed this latest slight. She understood that she was witnessing something far more significant than casual diplomatic conversation. These visitors were systematically undermining the legitimacy of her family's thousand-year legacy, doing so with smiles on their faces and diplomatic courtesy in their voices. The princess began to realize that her parents, constrained by the requirements of diplomatic protocol, were unable to respond to these challenges with the directness that the situation demanded. They were forced to maintain polite engagement even as their guests chipped away at the foundations of the institution they had dedicated their lives to serving. Prince William attempted to redirect the conversation by emphasizing the constitutional role of the monarchy and its importance in maintaining political stability. His response was thoughtful and well-reasoned, but Charlotte could see that the European delegation was not genuinely interested in understanding different perspectives. They had arrived with predetermined conclusions about the obsolescence of traditional monarchy. Klaus Müller responded to Prince William's explanation by suggesting that modern democratic institutions were better equipped to provide stability because they derive their authority from the consent of the governed rather than from historical accident. His words were a direct challenge to the principle of hereditary succession that had governed Britain for centuries. Charlotte watched her father's face as he absorbed this latest provocation. She could see the strain of maintaining diplomatic composure while defending principles that were fundamental to his identity and purpose. The 8-year-old princess began to understand that sometimes diplomatic courtesy could become a weakness that prevented necessary truths from being spoken. Marie Du Bois added her voice to the discussion by observing how enlightened European nations had discovered that equality of opportunity required the elimination of inherited privilege. While she avoided directly stating that monarchy was incompatible with modern values, her meaning was unmistakable to everyone in the room. Charlotte felt something stirring within her that she had never experienced before. It was a combination of anger, determination, and what could only be described as an awakening sense of duty that seemed to arise from somewhere deeper than her conscious mind. She was witnessing an attack on everything her ancestors had built and protected, and she realized that diplomatic niceties were preventing an adequate response. The conversation continued to spiral in directions that became increasingly uncomfortable for the royal family. The European visitors seemed to take their host's polite responses as encouragement to continue pressing their points about the supposed superiority of republican forms of government. Sophia Romano made another comment about how progressive societies had learned to evolve beyond traditional hierarchical structures. Her words carried an implicit suggestion that clinging to monarchy represented a kind of cultural backwardness that enlightened nations had overcome. Charlotte's hands clenched into small fists as she listened to this latest insult, disguised as intellectual observation. She could see that her parents were becoming increasingly frustrated with the direction of the conversation, but their commitment to diplomatic protocol prevented them from responding with the firmness that the situation clearly required. The princess began to understand that she was facing a moment that would define not just her own character, but potentially the future respect that international visitors would show to her family and the institution they represented. She could remain silent and allow these people to continue their subtle demolition of everything she had been raised to cherish, or she could find a way to remind them exactly where they were and who they were speaking to. Ambassador Larson, then, made what would prove to be the final mistake of the afternoon. He suggested that while the royal family certainly deserved appreciation for their service, it was important to remember that in democratic societies, no one is inherently superior to anyone else simply by virtue of their birth. Charlotte felt something snap inside her mind. The diplomatic facade that had been restraining her throughout the afternoon suddenly seemed less important than the need to defend her family's honor and the legitimacy of the crown. She was 8 years old, but she carried within her the genetic memory of monarchs who had faced down challenges far more serious than condescending European diplomats. The young princess took a deep breath and prepared to do something that would shock everyone in the room and establish once and for all exactly who held the authority in Windsor Castle. The storm that had been building throughout the afternoon was about to break, and Charlotte was ready to stand at its center. She looked around the blue drawing room, taking in the portraits of her ancestors who gazed down from the walls with expressions that seemed to encourage her to defend what they had spent their lives building and protecting. In that moment, Charlotte understood that some things were more important than diplomatic courtesy, and that sometimes even an 8-year-old princess needed to remind visiting adults about the fundamental realities of power and respect. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary among the castle staff and would forever change how foreign dignitaries approached their interactions with the British royal family. Charlotte was about to demonstrate that royal blood carried with it not just privilege, but also the responsibility and courage to defend the institution of monarchy against all challenges, regardless of how they might be disguised as polite diplomatic discourse. The moment that would define Princess Charlotte's character arrived without warning. Ambassador Larson had just finished making another observation about democratic equality when Sophia Romano decided to push the conversation one step further than anyone had anticipated. Looking directly at Charlotte with what she probably thought was a kindly smile, the Italian advisor addressed the 8-year-old princess directly for the first time that afternoon. "You know, Princess Charlotte," Sophia said in a tone that adults often use when speaking to children they consider too young to understand complex topics. "It must be wonderful to live in such a beautiful castle and have so many lovely things. But I hope you understand that what makes a person special isn't the house they live in or the family they're born into. What really matters is how we treat other people and what we do to help make the world a better place." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as the implications of Sophia's words settled over everyone present. While her statement might have sounded like harmless moral instruction to some observers, everyone understood that she had just directly challenged the fundamental principle upon which Charlotte's entire existence was based. She had suggested, in front of the princess's parents and in the heart of Windsor Castle itself, that hereditary monarchy was essentially meaningless. Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face as she processed what had just been said to her. This was not another indirect criticism of monarchical principles disguised as academic discussion. This was a direct personal attack on her identity, her family's legacy, and everything she had been raised to understand about her role in the world. Miss Patterson, Charlotte's governess, half rose from her chair as if to intervene, but the princess caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. Charlotte had made a decision that would surprise everyone in the room and establish her as a force to be reckoned with, despite her young age. Prince William and Princess Catherine exchanged concerned glances, unsure how their daughter would respond to such a direct challenge. They had witnessed Charlotte's intelligence and strong will many times in private family settings, but they had never seen her tested in a diplomatic situation where the stakes were so high and the potential for embarrassment so great. Charlotte took a moment to compose herself, drawing upon every lesson in royal deportment that she had absorbed throughout her young life. When she spoke, her voice was clear, steady, and carrying authority that seemed to arise from sources far deeper than her 8 years on Earth. "That's very interesting, Miss Romano," Charlotte began, her words carefully measured and her tone perfectly polite despite the steel that ran underneath. "But I think perhaps there's something you don't quite understand about where you are right now." The adults in the room tensed as they realized that Charlotte was not going to simply accept the rebuke she had been given. Sophia Romano looked surprised that the young princess was responding at all, having expected either silence or perhaps a childish protest that the adults could easily dismiss. Charlotte continued, her eyes never leaving Sophia's face as she spoke. "You see, you're absolutely right that people should be judged by their actions and how they treat others. But you seem to have forgotten something very important about our current situation." She paused for a moment, allowing the silence to build tension throughout the room. When she resumed speaking, every word was delivered with crystalline precision that left no doubt about her meaning or her confidence in what she was saying. "This castle has been the home of British monarchs for nearly 1,000 years. Every stone in these walls, every painting on these walls, every piece of furniture in this room has been placed here by my family. The guards who protected you as you entered this castle serve my family. The staff who prepared your lunch today work for my family. The very chair you're sitting in belongs to my family." Charlotte's voice grew stronger as she continued, and everyone in the room began to realize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was not a typical 8-year-old having a tantrum or expressing hurt feelings. This was a member of the royal family asserting her authority in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. "You are here today because my family invited you here," Charlotte continued, her gaze still fixed unwaveringly on Sophia Romano. "You ate food that my family provided, using china that belongs to my family, in rooms that have belonged to my family for centuries before you were born and will belong to my family for centuries after you're gone." The Italian advisor's face began to pale as she realized that her attempted lesson in democratic values had provoked a response that she was utterly unprepared to handle. She had expected to deliver a gentle correction to a privileged child, and instead found herself facing a direct challenge to her own position and authority. Charlotte rose from her chair with fluid grace, her posture perfect and her demeanor regal despite her small stature. Every person in the room could suddenly see the genetic inheritance that connected her to centuries of monarchs who had faced down challenges to their authority with similar determination and clarity. "I appreciate your thoughts about what makes people special," Charlotte said, her voice carrying a formality that made her sound far older than her years. "But I think you've misunderstood the nature of our relationship here today. You are not here as my equal, offering me guidance about life. You are here as my guest, in my home, by invitation of my family." Sophia Romano opened her mouth to respond, but Charlotte was not finished speaking. The princess had found her voice and her strength, and she was not going to be interrupted before she made her point completely clear. "The difference between us is not just about houses or possessions or privileges," Charlotte continued, her words cutting through the room like a blade. "The difference is that this is my family's realm. These are my family's people. This is my family's responsibility and my family's duty. You are visiting our home, but you seem to have forgotten that you are a guest here." Klaus Mueller attempted to interject with some comment about all people being equal in dignity, but Charlotte turned to face him with an expression that silenced him before he could complete his sentence. She had moved beyond caring about diplomatic niceties and was focused entirely on establishing the fundamental truth that seemed to have escaped her family's visitors. "You speak about equality and democracy as if those concepts somehow diminish what my family represents," Charlotte said, addressing the entire delegation now rather than just Sophia Romano. "But You misunderstand both democracy and monarchy if you think they cannot coexist. My family doesn't rule because we're better than other people. We serve because it is our duty, our responsibility, and our inheritance. Ambassador Larson tried to restore some diplomatic balance to the conversation by suggesting that everyone seemed to be talking past each other, but Charlotte was not interested in allowing the adults to smooth over what had just occurred. She had been challenged on fundamental questions of identity and authority, and she intended to respond completely. The crown doesn't exist because of democratic consent, Charlotte continued, her voice growing even more confident as she found her rhythm. Democratic institutions exist within the framework that the crown provides. Parliament meets in buildings that belong to the crown. Laws are passed in the name of the crown. Justice is administered by courts that derive their authority from the crown. She paused again, looking around the room at faces that showed varying degrees of shock, admiration, and concern. Her parents watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety as their 8-year-old daughter delivered a lecture on constitutional monarchy that would have impressed university professors. You came here today thinking you could educate a little girl about the importance of equality and democratic values, Charlotte said, her tone becoming sharper as she approached the climax of her response. But what you've actually done is demonstrate that you don't understand the first thing about the country you're visiting or the family you're speaking to. Sophia Romano made one final attempt to regain control of the situation by suggesting that Charlotte was obviously a very bright child, but perhaps didn't fully understand the complexity of modern governmental systems. This patronizing response proved to be the final mistake she would make that afternoon. Charlotte's eyes flashed with an anger that seemed to draw upon generations of royal authority as she delivered the words that would become legendary among the castle staff and would forever change how visiting dignitaries approached their interactions with the British royal family. "You are a guest," Charlotte said, her voice cutting through the room with absolute finality. "I am the blood." The silence that followed these words was complete and deafening. Every person in the room understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. An 8-year-old princess had not only defended her family's position with eloquence and authority that far exceeded her years, but she had done so in terms that left no possibility for further argument or discussion. Prince William and Princess Catherine stared at their daughter with expressions that mixed parental pride with amazement at the strength of character she had just displayed. Miss Patterson sat frozen in her chair, her pen still poised over a notebook, as if she were unsure whether what she had just witnessed should be officially recorded. The European delegation members exchanged glances that revealed their complete shock at what had just occurred. They had come to Windsor Castle expecting to engage in polite diplomatic discourse with a royal family they viewed as ceremonial figures playing traditional roles in a modern democracy. Instead, they had encountered a level of conviction and authority that forced them to completely reconsider their assumptions about the nature of contemporary monarchy. Charlotte remained standing, her posture perfect, and her expression serene despite the intensity of what had just transpired. She had defended her family's honor and established her own authority in terms that no one in the room would ever forget. The 8-year-old princess had proven that royal blood carried with it not just privilege and responsibility, but also the courage to stand firm against any challenge to the institution she had been born to serve and protect. The confrontation was over, but its implications would resonate far beyond the blue drawing room of Windsor Castle. The aftermath of Charlotte's declaration created an atmosphere in the blue drawing room that no amount of diplomatic training could have prepared anyone to handle. The words, "You are a guest, I am the blood," hung in the air like a sword that had been drawn and could not be easily sheathed. Every person present understood that they had witnessed something that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. Ambassador Larson was the first to attempt a response, his diplomatic instincts kicking in as he tried to find some way to restore equilibrium to a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. His face had turned an interesting shade of red as he processed the reality that an 8-year-old had just delivered the most effective rebuke he had encountered in decades of international diplomacy. "Your Royal Highness," he began, his voice carefully controlled but betraying underlying tension. "I think perhaps we have all allowed our discussion to become more intense than necessary. We certainly meant no disrespect to your family or your position." Charlotte remained standing, her posture unchanged and her expression serene but alert. She had not moved from her position near the window, but her presence now dominated the room in a way that seemed impossible for someone so young. When she responded to the ambassador's attempt at reconciliation, her voice carried the same authority that had marked her previous statements. "Ambassador Larson," she said, her tone formal but not unkind, "I appreciate your attempt to smooth over what has just occurred. But I think it's important that we all understand exactly what happened here this afternoon." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. The adults in the room found themselves hanging on every word spoken by this remarkable child who had somehow transformed herself from a polite young princess into a formidable defender of monarchical authority. "You and your colleagues came to our home today with certain assumptions about my family and our role in the modern world," Charlotte continued. "You spoke about democracy and equality and progress as if those concepts were somehow incompatible with constitutional monarchy. You suggested, both directly and indirectly, that hereditary leadership was an outdated concept that enlightened societies had moved beyond." Klaus Mueller shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Charlotte's analysis continued. He had indeed held those views when he arrived at Windsor Castle, but hearing them summarized so clearly by their 8-year-old host made them sound far more presumptuous than they had seemed during the earlier discussion. "What you failed to understand," Charlotte said, her voice growing stronger as she developed her theme, "is that you were not engaging in an academic discussion about governmental theory. You were guests in the home of the British royal family, questioning the legitimacy of your hosts while enjoying their hospitality." Marie Du Bois attempted to interject with some comment about mutual respect and open dialogue, but Charlotte's response cut through her diplomatic language with surgical precision. "Miss Du Bois," Charlotte said, turning to face the French cultural attaché directly, "there is nothing mutually respectful about coming into someone's home and suggesting that their entire way of life is illegitimate. There is nothing open about a dialogue where you assume your conclusions are correct before the conversation even begins." The princess moved away from the window and walked slowly around the room, her movement creating a sense of theater that emphasized the formality of what was occurring. She paused in front of a portrait of Queen Victoria, and for a moment, the resemblance between the 8-year-old princess and her great-great-great-grandmother was striking. "This room has hosted diplomatic meetings for over 200 years, Charlotte continued, gesturing toward the elegant furnishings and historical portraits that surrounded them. "Emperors, kings, presidents, and prime ministers have sat in these chairs and conducted the business of nations within these walls. Some came as allies, some as potential enemies, but all came with a fundamental understanding of where they were and who they were meeting. Sophia Romano, who had triggered the entire confrontation with her patronizing lecture about what made people special, sat silently with her hands folded in her lap. Her earlier confidence had evaporated completely as she realized that her attempt to educate a privileged child had instead revealed her own fundamental misunderstanding of the situation she had entered. Charlotte's governess, Miss Patterson, watched the proceedings with a mixture of professional pride and personal amazement. In 2 years of working with the princess, she had seen glimpses of the intelligence and strength of character that Charlotte was now displaying, but nothing had prepared her for witnessing such a complete and devastating defense of royal authority delivered by someone who still had several years before reaching double digits in age. Prince William and Princess Catherine remained silent, allowing their daughter to handle the situation she had chosen to confront. Both parents recognized that Charlotte was learning lessons about leadership and authority that no textbook could provide, and they understood that interrupting her now would diminish the impact of what she was accomplishing. The British Crown has survived for over 1,000 years because it understands something that you seem to have missed in your studies of democratic theory, Charlotte said, returning to stand in the center of the room, where everyone could see her clearly. Constitutional monarchy doesn't exist in opposition to democratic values. It provides the stable foundation that allows democratic institutions to function effectively. Her words carried a sophistication that would have been impressive coming from a political science professor, but delivered by an 8-year-old princess, they created an impact that transcended mere intellectual argument. Charlotte was not just defending monarchical theory. She was embodying the living reality of royal authority in a way that made abstract discussions irrelevant. Parliament derives its authority from the crown, she continued, her education in constitutional history serving her well as she explained concepts that her visitors clearly hadn't fully grasped. The judicial system operates in the name of the crown. The military serves the crown. These are not ceremonial relationships or historical curiosities. They're the fundamental structures that make British democracy possible. Ambassador Larson made another attempt to inject some diplomatic balance into the conversation by suggesting that everyone could learn from different perspectives and approaches to governance. Charlotte's response demonstrated that she had moved well beyond any interest in diplomatic pleasantries. "Ambassador, you're missing the point," she said with a directness that left no room for further evasion. "This isn't a debate between equals about the relative merits of different governmental systems. You're representatives of foreign governments who were invited here as guests. I am a member of the royal family in whose name this country is governed." The princess paused to let this fundamental distinction sink in before delivering what would prove to be the most memorable part of her entire response. "You seem to think that being a guest in our home gives you the right to question our legitimacy," Charlotte said, her voice taking on an edge that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "But the opposite is true. Being our guest creates an obligation to show respect for the institution you are visiting, whether you personally agree with it or not." Klaus Mueller attempted one final protest about the importance of honest dialogue between democratic nations, but Charlotte's response shut down any further discussion along those lines. "Mr. Mueller," she said, her tone becoming almost conversational, "if you were invited to someone's home for dinner, would you spend the entire meal explaining to your host why their lifestyle was outdated and their values were illegitimate? Would you consider that honest dialogue, or would you recognize it as incredibly rude behavior?" The German trade representative's face reddened as he realized that Charlotte had reduced his sophisticated political arguments to their essential social reality. He had been lecturing his 8-year-old hostess about the obsolescence of her family's role while enjoying their hospitality, and no amount of intellectual justification could disguise the fundamental inappropriateness of his behavior. Charlotte's final statement to the delegation was delivered with a calm authority that seemed to draw upon centuries of royal tradition while simultaneously establishing her own unique voice within that tradition. "I want to be very clear about something," she said, looking each visitor directly in the eyes as she spoke. "I don't need your approval of my family's position or your validation of the monarchical system. The crown doesn't exist because foreign diplomats think it should exist. It exists because it is woven into the fundamental structure of British society and has been for longer than any of your nations have existed in their current form." She moved back to her original position near the window, her physical movement creating a sense of conclusion to her remarks that left everyone understanding that the discussion was over. "You are welcome in our home as long as you remember that you are guests here," Charlotte concluded. "But if you cannot show appropriate respect for your hosts and the institution we represent, then perhaps your time at Windsor Castle should be shorter than originally planned." The silence that followed this statement was absolute. Every person in the room understood that they had just witnessed an 8-year-old princess not only defend her family's authority, but establish her own credibility as a future leader in terms that would be remembered long after the diplomatic niceties of the day were forgotten. Charlotte had transformed a routine diplomatic visit into a masterclass in royal authority, demonstrating that the strength of the British monarchy lay not just in its historical traditions, but in the character of the individuals who carried its responsibilities into each new generation. The confrontation was complete, but its implications would extend far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. The remaining hours of the diplomatic visit passed in an atmosphere of subdued formality that bore no resemblance to the earlier proceedings. The European delegation had been fundamentally transformed by their encounter with Princess Charlotte, and their behavior reflected a newfound understanding of the institution they were visiting and the family they were meeting. Ambassador Larson, who had begun the day with casual assumptions about the ceremonial nature of modern monarchy, found himself paying careful attention to every detail of royal protocol as the afternoon continued. His earlier confidence in democratic superiority had been replaced by a grudging respect for the 8-year-old princess who had delivered the most effective lesson in constitutional monarchy he had ever received. The tour of Windsor Castle that concluded the visit took on an entirely different character from what had been planned. Charlotte had volunteered to serve as guide for certain portions of the tour, and her commentary provided historical context that gave the European visitors a deeper appreciation for the institution they had been so quick to dismiss. As they walked through the grand corridor, Charlotte explained how various monarchs had contributed to the development of the castle over the centuries. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, but more importantly, her obvious personal connection to the history she was describing made it clear that this was not simply academic information she had memorized. This was her family's legacy, and she understood both the privileges and responsibilities that came with inheriting such a remarkable heritage. Sophia Romano, who had triggered the afternoon's confrontation with her patronizing lecture about what made people special, found herself listening intently to Charlotte's explanations of how different royal collections have been assembled and maintained over generations. The Italian advisor began to understand that she had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of hereditary responsibility and the kind of education required to prepare someone for a lifetime of service to constitutional monarchy. When they reached St. George's Chapel, Charlotte provided a detailed explanation of the religious and ceremonial significance of the space that demonstrated her understanding of the spiritual dimensions of royal duty. She spoke about the obligations that came with being anointed to serve the crown, making it clear that her family's position was about far more than privilege or historical accident. Klaus Mueller found himself particularly impressed by Charlotte's explanation of how the chapel had been used for royal weddings, funerals, and other state occasions throughout British history. Her description of these ceremonies revealed an understanding of symbolism and continuity that challenges earlier assumptions about the irrelevance of traditional institutions in contemporary society. Marie Du Bois was struck by Charlotte's obvious command of multiple languages as she translated Latin inscriptions and explained the meaning of various heraldic symbols throughout the chapel. The French cultural attaché began to realize that the education of a future monarch involved intellectual challenges and cultural sophistication that she had not previously considered. As the tour continued through the state apartments, Charlotte's commentary revealed the depth of her understanding of British history and constitutional development. She explained how different rooms had been used for various governmental functions over the centuries, making connections between historical events and contemporary constitutional arrangements that impressed even her parents. The visitors began to understand that they had been witnessing not just an 8-year-old's tantrum or a privileged child's sense of entitlement, but rather the emergence of someone who had been born and educated to carry forward a tradition of service that stretched back over a millennium. Charlotte's earlier confrontation with their assumptions had been based on knowledge, conviction, and a clear understanding of her own role and responsibilities. Prince William and Princess Catherine watched their daughter's performance throughout the afternoon with a mixture of pride and amazement. They had always known that Charlotte was intelligent and strong-willed, but they had never seen her demonstrate such complete command of both the intellectual content and the emotional significance of royal duty. Miss Patterson took careful notes throughout the tour, recognizing that she was witnessing a transformation in her pupil that marked a crucial stage in Charlotte's development as a future member of the royal family. The governess understood that the confrontation in the blue drawing room had awakened something in Charlotte that would influence the rest of her preparation for royal service. The castle staff who observed the afternoon's proceedings were equally impressed by Princess Charlotte's display of authority and knowledge. Guards, servants, and administrators who had worked at Windsor for decades found themselves viewing the young princess with newfound respect and anticipation for a future role within the institution they served. Captain James Morrison, the senior royal guard who had been present during the entire visit, would later describe the afternoon as the moment he truly understood what it meant to serve the crown. He had watched an 8-year-old princess defend the institution he had pledged his life to protect, and he recognized that he had witnessed the emergence of a future monarch who would command both respect and loyalty. As the European delegation prepared to depart Windsor Castle, the atmosphere was markedly different from their arrival. The casual confidence and subtle condescension that had characterized their earlier behavior had been replaced by formal courtesy and genuine respect for the institution they were leaving. Ambassador Larson's farewell comments to Prince William and Princess Catherine were carefully crafted to acknowledge both the educational value of their visit and the impressive qualities they had observed in Princess Charlotte. His words carried none of the patronizing undertones that had marked his earlier conversation, and his respectful tone reflected a fundamental shift in his understanding of contemporary monarchy. Sophia Romano approached Princess Charlotte directly before departing, offering what amounted to an apology disguised as appreciation for the learning experience the afternoon had provided. Her obvious discomfort revealed how completely Charlotte's response had undermined her earlier assumptions about privileged children and hereditary authority. Charlotte accepted these farewell courtesies with grace that demonstrated she understood the difference between winning a confrontation and maintaining diplomatic relationships. Her responses were polite but formal, making it clear that while she harbored no personal animosity toward her visitors, she expected future interactions to be based on appropriate respect for the institution she represented. The conversation that took place between Princess Charlotte and her parents that evening was one that would influence her development for years to come. Prince William and Princess Catherine wanted to ensure that their daughter understood both the significance of what had occurred and the responsibilities that came with the authority she had asserted. Charlotte's reflection on the day's events revealed a maturity that surprised even her parents. She explained that she had not been angry with the visitors personally, but rather felt compelled to defend the institution that gave meaning and purpose to her family's existence. Her analysis of the situation demonstrated that she understood the difference between personal feelings and constitutional duty. Miss Patterson's report on the day's events would become a legendary document within royal educational circles. Her detailed account of Charlotte's intellectual and emotional development captured a crucial moment in the preparation of a future monarch and provided insights that would influence royal education for generations to come. The European delegation's departure from Britain marked the end of a diplomatic visit that had achieved far more than anyone had anticipated. While the original agenda had focused on trade agreements and cultural exchanges, the real outcome was a demonstration of the continued vitality and relevance of constitutional monarchy in the modern world. News of Princess Charlotte's extraordinary defense of royal authority spread throughout diplomatic circles with remarkable speed. While the specific details of what had occurred were kept confidential, the general understanding that an 8-year-old princess had delivered a masterclass in constitutional monarchy became part of international diplomatic folklore. The long-term impact of that afternoon at Windsor Castle would extend far beyond the immediate participants. Future diplomatic visits to Britain would be planned with a much clearer understanding of the respect and protocol required when dealing with the British royal family. Charlotte's demonstration of royal authority had established new standards for international interactions with constitutional monarchy. Within the royal family itself, the events of that March afternoon marked a turning point in Charlotte's preparation for her future role. Her parents and education team recognized that she had demonstrated readiness for more advanced instruction in constitutional law, diplomatic protocol, and the historical foundations of British monarchy. Charlotte herself seemed to understand that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The 8-year-old princess who had defended her family's honor and authority would carry the memory and lessons of that confrontation throughout her development as a future monarch. The royal guard who had witnessed Princess Charlotte stand would tell his grandchildren about the afternoon when he truly understood what it meant to serve the crown. In his memory, the moment would always represent the perfect fusion of historical tradition and contemporary relevance that made constitutional monarchy a living, breathing institution rather than a mere historical curiosity. Princess Charlotte's declaration that she was the blood, while her critics were merely guests, had established a principle that would influence British diplomatic relations for decades to come. Her words had reminded everyone present that constitutional monarchy was not simply a quaint tradition maintained for tourist purposes, but rather a fundamental aspect of British national identity that commanded respect from anyone seeking to engage with the United Kingdom. The afternoon at Windsor Castle had proven that the future of the British crown rested in capable hands, and that the tradition of royal service would continue to evolve and adapt while maintaining its essential character and authority. Princess Charlotte had demonstrated that she was ready to carry forward a legacy that stretched back over 1,000 years, and her performance that day assured everyone who witnessed it that the crown would remain strong and relevant for generations to come.